Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Special exam preparation episode, A History of Archaeology.
E non posso più accucciarmi e così ritorno su. Lascio I colli nelle valli tra due salici piangenti. Io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
So we have said that we are on a temporary pause in the podcast, and we've actually reached a point that's not too bad. The start of centuries of foreign domination over Italy. A time when the country, in the words of some historians, was said to have fallen asleep. Although we know that this isn't really true, we will leave Italian history napping. I will, however, give you some content from the exam to become a tour guide that I'm working on so you don't forget me. So, this time round we're going to have a chat about archaeology. The first possibly surprising fact is that archaeology, which we associate generally with the study of very ancient prehistory and dinosaurs, as a discipline, the actual rules, methods, dating techniques, all of it, is surprisingly young, with the first university courses popping up in the 1800s. Today, I want to take you from rich guy collects cool old stuff for his house all the way to scientist uses a laser strapped to an airplane to find an entire buried city. That is a real sentence I'm going to explain later. This is the history of archaeology, and so let's get to it. First, the word itself. Archaeology comes from the Greek archaeologia, literally study of the past, or if you want to be extremely fussy about it, discourse on old things. Very on the nose, the ancient Greeks not known for their subtlety in naming things. The formalish definition is something like the reconstruction of past societies through the analysis of material remains that they leave behind. Which sounds very dry until you realize what it actually means in practice. It means archaeology is basically forensic science, like CSI or Dexter with less blood maybe, except the crime scene is hundreds or thousands of years old, and the victim is an entire civilization, and also nobody's dead. They just left. Well, they are actually all dead now, but they weren't murdered. Well, some of them were. Okay, well, you get the picture anyway. And there's a distinction worth knowing because it comes up constantly. Direct sources versus indirect sources. Indirect sources are things like written accounts or old drawings and maps, someone telling you about the past. Direct sources are actual physical stuff, artifacts, that is, things people make, and ecofacts, that is, natural remains that tell you about the relationship between people and their environment. Think seeds, animal bones, pollen, and so on. Archaeology at its core is obsessed with the direct stuff. The dirt doesn't lie. People do. Diaries lie. Propaganda lies. That one guy's memoir definitely lies. But a layer of soil with a broken pot in it is what it is. This can be a bit confusing for us as lovers of history, since also within the field of history, we speak of primary and secondary sources. That simply means that primary sources are the old documents, scrolls, inscriptions, and all that, whereas the secondary sources are the papers and books that historians write based on the primary sources. To summarize, archaeology deals with direct sources, while history deals with indirect sources, and within those indirect sources, there are primary and secondary, tertiary ones if you want, like a podcast. Okay, with that out of the way, how did anyone figure out how to actually do this systematically? Because for most of human history, study of the past basically meant rich person likes shiny old thing, buys shiny old thing. That's it. That was the whole field for centuries. Let's go back to the Renaissance, because that's really where our story kicks off. Picture 14th century Italy, which we've been doing for ages now. There's this renewed obsession with antiquity, Classical Greece and Rome are suddenly cool again after being kind of shrugged off for a while for all that naughty paganism. Two of the biggest literary celebrities of the era, or actually a bit earlier than that, Petrarch and Boccaccio, are personally out there collecting ancient coins and Greek inscriptions like their Renaissance Pokemon cards. This is generally where it starts, collecting for value, historical value, aesthetic value, prestige value, not for knowledge. Then you get a guy named Ciriaco de Pizzicolli, sometimes called Ciriac of Ancona, and honestly he might be the first field archaeologist, in spirit if not in method. The guy physically travels around collecting inscriptions and sketching monuments. He documents the Athenian Acropolis, the sculptures attributed to Phidias, being the first to confirm him as the architect of the Acropolis, and Ciriaco leaves behind actual written accounts of what he saw, like a 1400s travel blogger. Around the same time, Flavio Biondo basically invents topographic historiography, using the physical landscape itself, ruins and all, to reconstruct history, which again doesn't sound like a big deal until you realize this is the first time someone goes, hold on, the location of things is also data. And then the popes get involved because, of course, why wouldn't they? Sixtus IV, whom we know from the Lark of the Pazzi conspiracy, in 1471 sets up what's basically the first archaeological museum on the Capitoline Hill, stocked with bronzes pulled from the Lateran. And then in 1506, our other old buddy, Julius II, finds the Laocoön, that famous agonized marble sculpture group of a priest and his sons being crushed by sea serpents. And it goes straight into the Vatican collection. Museums are officially a thing now. Popes, unexpectedly good at starting archaeology museums, add it to their resume with the good and the naughty. Here's where it gets fun, because now we start getting proto-scientists poking around. Giorgio Agricola, working in the late 1400s and early 1500s, is out there studying ancient stone tools and is basically considered the father of modern geology. People are starting to look at old rocks and go, hang on, that rock was worked on purpose, leading to the idea of stone tools. Michele Mercati, around the same time, is studying prehistoric weapons and makes this generally wild leap for the time. He proposes that iron was used in warfare before people figured out how to work it into more refined tools. Basically, an early stab at materials evolve in a sequence thinking, which, spoiler, becomes a massive deal later on. And then Pirro Ligorio, a 16th century antiquarian in the classical sense, gets commissioned by Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, brother-in-law of our friend Lucrezia Borgia, to go dig around Villa Tivoli. And he does an actual excavation, actual investigation on a genuinely large scale for the time. This guy is basically cosplaying as a professional archaeologist 200 years before that's a job anyone can have. By the 1600s, sources are finally starting to get tested rather than just admired. And this is when the word we actually use shows up. Jacob Spon, a French antiquarian active in the mid to late 1600s, is credited with introducing the actual term archeologia into common use. The discipline is starting to want its own name, its own identity, separate from just history or collecting old stuff. Right around there, Francesco Bianchini starts applying philological methods, a kind of close reading textual analysis techniques used on ancient manuscripts, to images. He's doing comparative iconography before iconography is even really a formalized concept. Reading pictures like their texts. Quite a smart move, actually. Then, the 1600s to 1700s. This stretch is generally the foundation of the modern archaeological method. Two names matter enormously here. One is John Aubrey, an English antiquarian, and he gives us the chrono-typological method. Basically, the idea that you can put objects in a time sequence based on their type, their form, how their style changes. Groundbreaking idea. Things evolve in a recognizable, orderly way, and if you understand the sequence, you understand time. And then Olof Rudbeck. He was a Swedish scholar, and he gives us something arguably even bigger, the stratigraphic method. This is the idea, foundational to literally everything we do today in archaeology, that layers of earth, the strata, accumulate over time, and the deeper you go, generally, the older things are. It sounds obvious now, it was not obvious then. This is digging in a systematic, layer-by-layer way and paying attention to what's in each layer. As a scientific concept, and it is generally one of the most important ideas in the entire history of the field. Everything downstream of this, every excavation grid, every site report, traces back to this one insight. Then, something happened. Well, something had already happened, but it was only around 1763 that everyone realized what had happened. You see, back in 1594, an architect, Domenico Fontana, was overseeing work on a canal south of Naples and found remains of epigraph, writing on stone, and thought, this is old and interesting, but that was it for the time being. Then around 150 years later, the King of Naples at the time, Charles III of Bourbon, said to Roch Jacquin de Alcubierre, "Hey, remember that cool old stuff they found while digging south of Naples? Why don't you see if you can find some more?" He did. Not only did he find more, but he found a whole buried city. It was not until 1763 that an inscription was found, Res Publica Pompeiarum. Pompeii had been discovered. This excavation, as well as Herculaneum, kicking off in the late 1700s, absolutely reignited public obsession with the ancient concept, Roman daily life, frozen in volcanic ash, just sitting there. This is the moment archaeology goes from niche scholarly hobby to thing normal educated Europeans are captivated by. The British Museum and the Louvre are founded off the back of this energy, hoovering up antiquities from across Europe and beyond. By 1818, the city of Leiden establishes the first university chair in archaeology, and Berlin follows in 1823. It's now officially an academic discipline with actual professors and actual departments. Not bad for a field that started with, hey, nice coin. So we're in the 1800s, and this is the century that really delivers. So buckle up. Jean-François Champollion deciphers Egyptian hieroglyphics using the famous Rosetta Stone, cracking open an entire civilization's written record that had been silent for over 1,000 years. Genuinely one of the great intellectual triumphs in history, and it basically launches Egyptology as its own field overnight. Then, and I promise this is worth knowing, even if you never remember another name from this episode, Christian Jorgensen Thomsen. That is, Christian Jorgensen Thomsen. A Danish scholar, he formalized the 3-age system: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. He looks at the collections of artifacts and realizes these aren't just randomly different. They represent successive technological stages, and you can use the material, stone, then bronze, then iron, as a chronological marker. This becomes the backbone of how we organize prehistory still today. Meanwhile, over in the Aegean, Heinrich Schliemann is out there excavating Troy and Mycenae, chasing Homer's epic like they're a treasure map. Which, controversially, kind of worked. Not the most careful excavator by modern standards, if we're being honest, he did plenty of damage in his enthusiasm, but he proved that myth and legend could point towards real, physical, buried history. That's a huge deal, methodologically and culturally. Then, of course, now, thanks to Nolan's Odyssey, which I have seen and loved, everybody is now an expert of the Trojan War. And back at Pompeii, Giuseppe Fiorelli takes over the excavation and introduces one of the most quietly emotional techniques in all of archaeology, pouring plaster into the voids left in the volcanic ash by decomposed bodies. Suddenly, you're not looking at bones, you're looking at the actual shape of a person's last moments. It's haunting. It's also a masterclass in the use of material silence available creatively. If you have ever been to Pompeii and seen the Garden of the Refugees, with the plaster casts of adults and children fleeing in vain for their lives, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, go. Along came the 1900s and the start of the modern era of archaeology. So this is where, very quickly, because we could do an entire special episode on this, archaeology basically merges with hard science and becomes what is called archaeometry, literally measuring the past using techniques borrowed from physics, chemistry, and geology. A quick highlight reel because some of these are pretty cool. So the more well-known radiocarbon dating with carbon-14, measuring the predictable decay rate of a radioactive isotope to date organic material up to around 50,000 years old. This is the single most famous dating method in the field and changed everything. It was the one, for example, which was used to date the Holy Shroud of Turin to around the 1300s. The idea is basically that this element, carbon-14, decays at a very steady rate for any kind of substance. Then there's potassium-argon dating, which is used for much, much older material, especially in volcanic contexts going back over 40,000 years, which is great for early human prehistory sites. Then there is thermoluminescence, used especially on ceramics, meaning that energy released from a fired object to figure out when it was last heated. Basically, the pottery remembers being fired when we can ask it about it. Then there is dendrochronology, dating via tree rings. Every ring is a year, wide rings mean good growing conditions, narrow rings mean rough ones, and you can cross-match patterns across samples like a fingerprint. This is delightfully analog in a section full of physics. And then technology just keeps escalating from there. Remote sensing, aerial photography, magnetometry, which is detecting buried structures by measuring distortions in the Earth's magnetic field, geoelectric prospection, ground-penetrating radar. Archaeologists are basically doing medical imaging on the ground now, non-invasive scans to see what's buried before anyone even picks up a shovel. And yes, I promised you the laser thing. The LIDAR, light detection and ranging, fires pulses of laser light from a plane or a drone and maps the ground surface with incredible precision, even through thick jungle canopy. This is how entire lost Maya cities have been rediscovered in the last couple of decades. Canopy that would take a human surveyor a lifetime to walk through, mapped from the air in days. We really have gone from guy with a sketchbook in the Acropolis to laser-equipped aircraft revealing a hidden city. One last thing before we wrap up, because I think it's the most human part of the story. Archaeology today isn't just find object, date object. It's gone deeply interdisciplinary. There's landscape archaeology, which studies the relationship between whole regions and the people who shaped and were shaped by them over time. Not just single sites, but entire territories. Read like a long-form historical document written in dirt, rivers, and field boundaries. There's ethnoarchaeology, pioneered by people like Louis Binford, which studies living traditional communities, often in places like Africa, to understand how material culture is actually used and discarded in real time, so we can better interpret the ancient stuff we dig up. Basically, let's ask living people how objects get broken and buried so we can stop guessing about the ancient ones. There's archaeobotany and archaeozoology, dealing with plant and animal remains, generally some of the most information-dense evidence you can find, because a single seed or bone fragment can tell you about diet, trade, climate, and domestication all at once. Then there's urban archaeology, looking at existing cities and seeing what's under the buildings. These are the sort of things you see often in churches that are built on older churches or Roman temples. And then there's the whole legal and ethical side too, because once you accept that stuff belongs to everyone's shared history, you need rules. Italy alone has gone through a whole legislative history on this. A 19th century Rossi law, the Mussolini-era heritage protections in 1939, its enshrined right in the 1948 Constitution, Article 9, if you're curious, the Republic is constitutionally required to protect landscape and historical artistic heritage, all the way up to the modern Codice dei Beni Culturali, the Code of Cultural Heritage, and EU-era funding initiatives aimed at digitalizing and restoring archaeological sites. It turns out, who gets to keep the old stuff and how carefully do you have to treat it is a genuinely complicated legal question, and it took centuries to even start answering it properly. So, from Petrarch buying cool coins, to Gregorio digging up a cardinal's backyard, to a guy from Denmark going, wait, stone, then bronze, then iron, to plaster casts of Pompeii's final moments, to an actual laser strapped to a plane finding cities under jungle canopy, that's the history of archaeology. A field that started as rich person hobbyism and ended up being one of the most scientifically rigorous ways we have of listening to people who have been dead for thousands of years. Next time you see a chipped stone tool in a museum case and think, cool rock, just remember there is a 500-year multi-continent chain of increasingly clever humans who had to invent the entire concept of asking that rock a question before we can even get to cool rock. Respect the rock. Respect the process. Thank you very much for listening. A History of Italy, as you know, is created and presented by me, Mike Corradi, and supported by my lovely Patreon supporters, who I'll go back to nominating when we get back sooner than I expected to our regular programming. I should be able to get another episode out soon. Until then, if you want to get in touch, please do. hello@ahistoryofitaly.com. And of course, you can help support the show by becoming a Patreon supporter and have access to extra content and early information, such as the big announcement that's just about to come up in a couple of weeks. So the Patreons know all about that already. And then, of course, you can support on PayPal or on Tipeee. And soon, some more merchandise is coming as well. If you would just like to get in touch, please do so. hello@ahistoryofitaly.com, or follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.